So my mother, yes, so they came here in 1921. They arrived on election day, and they didn't let them off the boat until the next day. I don't know why, but my grandfather came here. His After the war, his brother Harry came to America. So that must have been 1918, maybe. And he wrote back. My grandfather was Jacob. He wrote to him and he said, "You need to come here. The streets are not paved with gold, but it isn't Tomaszów Mazowiecki either." So he wanted to come, and my grandparents were Orthodox Jews, which pretty much everybody in that part of the world who was Jewish, they all were. So my grandmother kept saying no. She said, "You'll go to America, you'll cut off your beard, you'll be no more a Jew." So, but then she noticed that there were several men going into the village, like to get milk, and then they weren't coming back because they wouldn't listen to their wives, and they came to America. So she finally gave him permission, and he came, and he saved enough money so that they were able to come in 1921, and they moved to a place called Paterson, New Jersey, which is where my father also was living with his parents. And because they thought my mother was 9 years old, there was no English as a second language in those days. So they put her into school number 9, into first grade, and she graduated 2 years later, first in her class. And then she couldn't go. Her words to me were, she cried bitterly because she couldn't go to high school because she had to go to work in the silk mills, because she was the oldest of the children. And the baby of the family, my Uncle Arthur, is the only child who was born here. And I always felt that he got to be so tall because he had different food than they had, I don't know. My grandfather had been in the Russo-Japanese War. I don't know exactly what years, but I know that he was in the army then because the Russians conscripted everybody. So when, I guess it was the Second World War was coming along, they wanted to get them as well. And my grandmother had my grandfather I don't know how many beds they had, all these, get into bed. Must have been at least a double bed or whatever. And then I think she put a feather mattress over him. And then my mother got into the bed, and my grandmother covered her with blankets. And when these jerks came in, they were hunting everywhere and yelling at her, and "Where is he?" And they had guns with bayonets, and they went under the bed. They never found him. So my mother saved her father's life at a very young age. My mother was a redhead, and she actually died 5 weeks before she turned 85, but her hair was still red. She never dyed it. It's pretty amazing. I'm like, my hair is dark like yours, or was, shall I say, and now look at me. But my grandmother was the second of 5 daughters. There was 5 daughters and a son. And her older sister, when she was born, my grandmother's father went somewhere on a train, and he met a man whose wife had just given birth to a boy. And they matched. It's called a shidduch. They matched them. That when they grew up, they were going to get married, and they did. Yeah. And my grandmother could see that her sister wasn't that happy. So she told her father, "I want to have something to say about who I marry." Yeah. Now, my grandmother was blonde with blue eyes. I don't remember seeing her that way, but that's what she was. She was a blonde with blue eyes. So along came one man. He was a redhead, and he was a carpenter, and he earned a good living, and my grandmother would have nothing to do with him. She hated redheads. Yes, exactly. So along came my grandfather Jacob, who was looked kind of like a young Omar Sharif, piercing black eyes, very good-looking man. So they got married, and 9 months later, out came my mother with her red hair and her black eyes. Man plans and God laughs. She went to work in the silk mills, and my father, they met somehow, and she went to night school, I think, a bit. But so they eventually met, and they fell in love, and they became engaged. And then my father's mother died, and he would not see my mother like for a year. Every Friday night he was in temple, and so it wasn't until after a year that they began seeing each other again. And then they did. They got married on December 15th, 1929, and I believe that's the day of the stock market crash. Now, my parents were so poor. I tell people, the guys on Wall Street were throwing themselves out of the buildings and, dying on the sidewalk, that my parents would have had to go up to the sidewalk to get to the sidewalk. No money, no money. And one of all the silk mills closed. It was a horrible situation. And one of my parents' friends, I thought he was really an uncle, but you got a lot of aunts and uncles in those days, so you wouldn't be calling them Mr. and Mrs. So I had an Uncle Julian and Aunt Faye, and he had a bit of money, so he said that he was going to move out to Pennsylvania and open a silk mill. And if my parents wanted to come, and they did, and they went there, and that's where my brother was born in 1934. They were in Berwick, Pennsylvania, and then they moved to Allentown, Pennsylvania, and then another Uncle Julie, who was a lawyer, he knew my mother was a real smart person, really smarty, and he decided to loan my mother and father some money so they could buy a business, and he did, and they did, and they bought a store which he made a luncheonette, and we lived upstairs from the store. I was born when they owned that store. I was born in Patterson, but so that's where I lived. And what happened was, as I mentioned, I was born 5 weeks before Pearl Harbor, and the Second World War took quite a long time. And catty corner to the back of my parents' store was the Walter Kitty Company, and the Walter Kitty Company makes fire extinguishers, and they turned into a war factory, and so my parents' business was phenomenal, and they got to pay off my Uncle Julie, and they moved, and we moved to the Jersey Shore, and I was 6.5 when we moved. And first, we spent the first summer in Point Pleasant Beach, which is one of my favorite beaches in New Jersey. And then they bought a house in Bradley Beach, which, if anybody knows where Asbury Park is, there's Asbury Park, and then tiny little thing, and then Bradley. Yeah. Bradley was a big town. It was 12 blocks by 12 blocks. I lived 5 blocks from the beach. And my father bought a liquor store. I never saw my parents drink. The only time they would drink would be at Passover. And if they went to a party, like if they went into New York to my teachers, maybe they would have, I never saw them drink. Yeah. And then they decided to sell that store, and they bought another luncheonette in Fair Lawn, New Jersey, which is where I basically grew up. When I was 9 or not, just 9.5, they bought that store. And I grew up in Fair Lawn, New Jersey. Because Frank is 7.5 years older than I. So when I was born, he was already studying the piano. He ultimately became a concert pianist. So my whole life was, and still is, involved with music and the piano. And today I won't tell you the story of how Mr. Johnson came to be his teacher, but he did, and My brother moved into New York and lived with him and went to a private school for kids who are on Broadway and stuff and the ballet companies. And he wouldn't teach me till I was 10 because he said I wouldn't sit there and behave. I had wanted to be a ballerina. My parents took me to my first ballet when I was 4 and a half, and it was a Sunday afternoon, and it was in New York, and it was a children's program. I remember Peter and the Wolf was on it, but I just remember one of the other, they were like single acts of ballets, and they did the second act of Swan Lake, and when the Swan Queen came out from that, well, from that end of the stage, I fell in love, and I have never recovered. And I did study ballet for a long time, but then my fingers were much more talented than my feet, so the piano basically took over. However, I did manage to get my daughters to be ballerinas for a while. Yes. So, and I went to Fair Lawn High School, and I studied Spanish there because my brother and Mr. Johnson, my brother studied Spanish, and so the two of them used to talk in front of me. And I couldn't understand what they were saying. It made me nuts. So I decided when I went to high school, so that's what I did. And I took 3 years in high school and 1 year in college, and I'm still fluent. And I had no idea in 1959 when I graduated from high school that Spanish was going to become such an important language in the United States. I was just lucky. So I went to Boston University, and how had I met your grandfather, your papu? My parents had the luncheonette, and they decided eventually to close for a week during the summer and go on vacation. And they went twice to the Catskill Mountains to a hotel called Young's Gap, and of course I went with them. And in that week I fell in love with everybody under the sun, every guy that was there. The first summer, some of them were still the same. The second summer, cried my eyes out on the way home. And then I was at a party, and somebody came running up in Teaneck, and somebody came running up behind me, put his hands over my head and said, "Guess who?" Well, it was Normie Gross, and he had been the lifeguard. And we decided that I would make a party, and he could bring the boys from New York, and I would supply the girls. And among them, and I think it had a lot to do with the fact that Michael had a car. He had a Packard. And in those days, you could put 3 people in the front seat and 3 people in the back seat. And so they came, and we didn't hit it off immediately. I kind of fell for a couple of other guys that came. And I took my SATs on December 6th, 1958, I guess. And I had been being tutored with math because it was not my great suit, but English was not a problem for me. And so I had been studying and studying and studying. And on Monday, the week of my SATs, Norman Gross, the lifeguard, called me up, and he said, "How you doing?" He said, "Can you go to the movies Friday night?" And I said, "There's no way. I have to take the SAT Saturday morning at 8 or 7 or something." And he said, "Go ask your mother." So I went and I asked my mother, and she said, "Well, Susan, what you don't know by 8 o'clock on Friday night, not going to make such a difference for 8 o'clock Saturday morning." And so I went. But I came back to the phone, and I told him, and he said, "Oh, great." He says, "I'm taking your girlfriend, Gail Wasserloff, and you're going to go with Mike." Mike? Who's Mike? And he described him, and the only reason I had some sense of what he looked like was because he wore glasses. And he called me up. Michael called me up, and we spoke for a little while. And I got off the phone, and I said to my mother, I said, "Well, if he is anything like his voice is very sexy. I said, is he's anything like his voice? So we went out, and of course, Michael drove because he's the one with the car. And we went to see, I think it was called The Love Boat, and it was with Sophia Loren and Cary Grant. And um, in Fairlawn High School, the senior prom is in December. I had that party in October, I think, and or November, and I had a boyfriend that my parents didn't want me to see, and I wanted to go to the prom with him, and I knew that they would never let me. So when we got back from the movies, we're sitting out in front of my parents' house, and we're starting to become familiar with one another. That would be a nice way to put it. And I never had a curfew, and we had a bay window in the front, a large window, and I know that, and the couch said, and I'm sure that my mother was sitting on the couch watching whatever was going on in the car if she could see. And then I asked Michael, I said, my prom is, what? I said, would you like to go to my prom? And he said, yes. I had asked Normie Gross, and he said, I'm not putting on one of those monkey suits. Anyway, so he did. He took me to the prom. And if you see my yearbook, it says that Susan can be found usually on the phone with Mike. Can you believe that? So, and we dated for quite a while. And then he went down to Florida. He was at City College on intercession. And he came back, and he came to see me once, and then I didn't hear from him for 9 months. Well, long story about that, but you don't need to know the whole story. But we did begin to date again, and ultimately got married, had Lisa, 27 months later had Jackie, and 9 years later had Ari, had your father. I mean, I started to teach piano when Jackie was 3 years old. And then we bought a house, and I was still teaching piano. And I really enjoyed it, and my life was okay. We belonged to a swim club, and the girls were already studying ballet. And they would have camp at the swim club. So Lisa and Jackie were not in the same class in the ballet school. So when it was time for Lisa to go to class, she would take her leotard and junk and bring it in the car and change out of her bathing suit and get into the leotard and stuff so she could take class. And then I would go back to the swim club, and I would get Jackie and do the exact same thing and drop Jackie off, and then I would bring Lisa home. And one time, this was after your father was born, I went to pick Jackie up, drop Lisa off, and I forgot to pick Jackie up. Well, there were no cell phones or anything in those days, and it wasn't until I got to the farm market where I was going to pick up my corn that I realized that I forgot her. But I couldn't call. I mean, I went back there, but Jackie says to Lisa, Mommy's not there. Lisa said, of course she's there. She just dropped me off. Well, they had the whole school hunting for me, and I wasn't there. And I did come back. And it is kind of embarrassing to forget your child. We lived in a garden apartment, and eventually we bought a house in West Orange. Very nice house, and that's where we lived until, I guess, Jackie was in junior high, and maybe Lisa was in 10th grade. We bought a house in Short Hills, and we moved there. And when we lived in West Orange, the kids' elementary school was around the corner, and the junior high was across the street, and the high school was behind that. Well, where we moved, they had to take a bus to school, so it was very different. It was very different. But, and things got to be difficult in my marriage, and ultimately there was a divorce. And it was very, very hard. I mean, that was a very difficult time. and it was hard on the girls. The girls decided to stay with him because he was able to keep the house so they could continue and graduate in their high school. But your father came with me, and I remarried, and I was married to Michael, to my first husband, for 18 years. I was married to Peter for 24 years until he fell in love with someone at work and went bye-bye. Your father was brought up primarily by Peter, and he was a good example because Peter would clean the house, he would cook, and he did all kinds of stuff. He wasn't a man who expected you to. He was home more than I was, so that was a good thing. And so Ari, as you know, had some good ideas when he and managed to get married. I remember him bathing you when you guys were infants. I do. Yeah. Well, my mother came at half fare on a boat from, I think they sailed from Brussels, Belgium, is I think where they sailed from. Of course, they had to take trains and whatever from Poland. And my father, his baby brother was born also in America, but he was one of, let me think, there was Abe and Ike and Sam and, my God, Aunt Bert, and then Charlie, and then another aunt. He was like the oldest of about 7, I think. And he learned English. I mean, he was only 6 years old, so. And yeah, and his brother, the baby brother, was born. His name was Charlie, and he was a blonde with curly hair, and he refused to let anybody cut his hair until he really went to school, and they told him if he didn't cut his hair, he couldn't go to kindergarten. So Charlie got his hair cut. And I can't go back at this point any further in my family's history. But when I watch those ancestry programs, I wish that I could be invited on one of them and take me back. But what I will tell you is that my grandfather and grandmother were the only ones that came from Poland after the First World War. And so my grandmother's three other sisters and her brother, they all stayed. And every last one of them died in the Holocaust. Except for one young man, somebody had a son who managed to survive. And he ended up in a Siberian labor camp, I guess under the Russians. And there he met and married a woman, and they had a baby. And I guess they gave them, I don't know, a couple of days off or something for having the baby. So they packed up everything they owned, and they walked from Siberia to Istanbul, Turkey, where they were able, it was 1948, they were able to get on a ship and go to Israel, because Israel was now a country. So that far back I can go. And with my father's family, a lot of them had come to America. Some of them lived in Canada, but it's foggy. It's foggy for me. But so that's basically about the history of my ancestry. It's about as far back as I can go.